and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. My name is Joan Higginbotham, and I'll be your host for this evening's program. In 1973, the governor of Minnesota was pictured on the cover of Time magazine holding a large fish, which he later admitted he had not caught. The title of the article was "The State That Works," and it featured Minnesota, and it said that we were indeed a state that works. Well, tonight we have with us Tom Berg, and Tom was in the legislature during this period when Minnesota worked, and he has written a book about that period from roughly 1970 to 1980, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about the book and maybe learn a few things about how we can make government work better today and why it worked then, why we were the state that worked. Tom, you were in the legislature for 10 years.
8 years, Joe.
8 years.
From 70 to 1978.
78. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting period.
It was a very interesting period, a fascinating period, and a truly historic period for Minnesota, because in the 72 election, the Democrats took control of both House and the Senate, and Wendell Anderson was then the governor, and that was the first time in the state's history that the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate and the governorship. Which
is what we have now.
Is exactly what we have now. There's lots of similarities.
Yeah, well, and we're going to get into some of those in a little bit, but let me just ask you first, so why did you write the book? And I know this took you 8 years to do, so this was not something that you got into lightly.
No, I worked on it for a long period of time, and I wanted to, one, memorialize a very critical piece of Minnesota's history that had not been written down, at least in one place, very well. And secondly, I wanted to have my say, because I got so disgusted with what I call the bumper sticker approach to governing that seems to be going on in the country, and to try to educate in a very readable way, hopefully with a book, more people about how it really works in government.
What really happens.
And what really happens, right. Some of it good, some of it not so good.
Now, one thing that really interested me was the fact that you were able to work with people from across the aisle. And then in those days, you were liberals and conservatives.
Correct. I was first elected in 1970, and then we were liberals and conservatives. There was nothing on the ballot except your name. And then in the 73 session, that was changed to become like the rest of the world, and Democrats and Republicans, and you had party labels on.
Of course, we all knew what liberals really meant.
Sure, it was kind of a fiction in my judgment, and so it was a truth in advertising kind of bill, and specified what party people would caucus with.
Well, the article, or the law that was passed that the title is sort of based on, is the education bill, or the reform of the way education was funded, the Minnesota Miracle. And that's a really great case study. Can you talk a little bit about what happened and how it happened?
It's a fascinating story, and it's a fascinating story about civic engagement with groups. There was a group, the Citizens League played a key role, and groups like that, Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, it shows the significant importance of that to government, or what they can do. In the election of 1970, property taxes became the big issue. Property taxes were way up in Minnesota, and there were protests, and 1,000 people came down to the Capitol, and so on and so forth. And the Citizens League had been studying this, and they came out with a report in the fall of 70, right in the middle of the campaign, that said the state should play a much greater role in the revenue raising and distribution process in Minnesota. And they called for the state legislature in particular to step in and raise some more revenue and replace these property taxes that were so high that are raised and set by the local units of government in the state. And that became the issue during the campaign. Wendy Anderson was the candidate for the Democrats, a senator from St. Paul, and Doug Head, a very well-regarded Republican, was Attorney General of the state, and he was the Republican candidate. And the election went back and forth, and they had the annual dinner of the Citizens League, and they asked candidates, well, what do you think of our report?
Oh, okay.
And of course, Wendy Anderson said, I generally support it. Doug Head said, I've got some misgivings about it. I think local control is important, and it may lead to fiscal irresponsibility and things, and the battle was joined. And on November 4th, Wendy Anderson won with 54% of the vote, and so he became governor, but the Republicans kept control of the legislature, both in the House and the Senate, although the Democrats made big gains then. And then during that session, Wendell Anderson proposed a significant increase. I think it was something like 37% increase in taxes in one fell swoop in that session of the legislature.
Now, as a legislator, what did you think? Oh my gosh.
Well, yes, exactly. I think most of us were very worried, and I was a rookie.
It was your first
then
step,
in the minority party. I was a Democrat. We didn't have control and wasn't quite sure what to make of all of this. And so that went on, and the legislature ran out of time in May. And in those days, we didn't talk about shutdowns. They had passed the major appropriation bill so the government could keep on running. And the governor called us back into special session immediately, that very next day. He said, come back here, go to work. I want this resolved. I want it along what I think about, what I proposed during this session. And during that session, then the conservatives passed a bill in about July of that year.
So this is, the session ended in May. This is July. We're still still meeting.
We're still meeting, and they passed a bill. The governor got it at his desk, and he vetoed it. Blasted the Republicans for what they had done on this matter. And then he changed strategy and said, you know, instead of going back into this session, I would like to have a committee of 10 people named, 6 conservatives and 4 liberals, and I want you to come over to the governor's residence and meet there instead of at the Capitol. And we're going to hammer this thing out.
That sounds very familiar.
Yes, it does. Yes, and it worked in this case.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
And it worked. And it worked largely because a Republican or conservative senator then named Stanley Holmquist chaired the meetings. He was a business person, a former superintendent of schools and teacher, and a close friend of his colleague in the Senate in their days, Wendell Anderson. And he chaired this committee, and they went back and forth, and the liberals on the committee agreed and the governor to lower their requested income tax a little bit and to put another penny on the sales tax. And Stanley Holmquist said, well, I can support that and work this through. And finally, in October, the end of October, Joan, of that year, a bill was agreed upon which raised state revenues phenomenally. The actual number, I think, was about 23%.
Wow.
And the governor signed it, and that became known as the Minnesota Miracle. And what it did was it raised it raised income and sales tax. Every bracket, income tax bracket went up. The sales tax went up. Taxes on beer and cigarettes and other taxes went up. But the state then took that money and sent it back to local governments and school districts, as you mentioned. And they redistributed the money in such a way that it cut down the disparity in spending between rich property districts and poor property districts.
And this was the miracle.
And that became known as the Minnesota Miracle.
Now, was that when local government aid started? I mean,
yes, it was a major player in getting local government aid going. There had been various aids, but it changed that significantly. And that set the Minnesota government on a course that became one of the real national leaders for, I think, a couple of decades.
Now, the interesting thing is that before we started, you said that you were worried about the next election because you had passed this big tax increase.
I was very worried about the next election. I think most of us were. But an interesting thing is 90% of those of us who voted for this huge 23% increase in one fell swoop got reelected that year.
Wow.
And part of that, I think, Joan, was because of extensive media coverage all along. And so the populace in Minnesota got to understand some of the nitty-gritty of how government works and how it's financed, and the questions of who pays and how much, and just that, because day after day after day during this summer-long session, there'd be stories about it. Editorial boards weighed in. groups like the League and the Citizens League and various groups were monitoring this, and it became quite an educational vehicle for people in the
now,
state.
it seems really interesting to me because that sounds so familiar with what we're facing now, with people saying, well, you know, we need more tax revenue because property tax is going up and the LGA is being cut, but yet there doesn't seem to be any kind of movement on either side, or not much movement, I should say.
Not yet, Joan, but remember, we got a long way to go if we're going to get to October before we get that done.
If we're going to wait that long.
That's right. But it's remarkably similar in a lot of ways. You have a governor who has proposed a very major tax increase, not only income taxes, but you know, it talked about a significant expansion of the sales tax and then lowering the rate, and that has since been taken off the table. But it was a major proposal, and I think a very honest proposal to see how we're going to fund services in the state and lower property taxes. I think, and also the tax on cigarettes. And so there's some real similarities to what's going on, and how it's all going to play out this year remains to be seen.
We still don't know.
Right.
Well, but the interesting thing is that you saying that the press and the public sort of got the idea, and they were willing, they seem to be, obviously, since 91% of the people who voted for it were reelected, they seem to accept the fact that there had to be an increase in taxes.
I think they did. I know they did, because there was that election. And it was, I think, sold quite well by those of us who voted for it and the governor as a big change in the important thing for schools primarily, because the schools had gotten way out of whack, so that school districts that had not much property tax base, just a bunch of little homes in a small suburb, for example, it was really hard for them to fund their schools. And yet if you had a big shopping center or a taconite mine or a power plant in your district, you had more property tax base that you could use to raise money with. It was easier to fund schools. So they had good schools.
Sure.
And the whole thing with this Minnesota Miracle was taking that increase in state money and spreading it out around the state in a more even, fair manner. And that was sold or told to the people, and I think they accepted that. They realized that had to happen.
And so we sort of turned that on the head, because Governor Pawlenty said, well, you cities shouldn't be dependent upon that local government aid. We're going to cut that. So, I mean, it was a whole shift in what the right thing to do was.
There was a big shift, and I think we're paying the price for it. And I think this session in particular is wrestling with it in an honest way, trying to come up with how we're going to resolve this and get out of the hole we dug for ourselves in the last few years. Now,
in your introduction and in the book, you talk about the concept of federalism, which we've talked about indirectly, the idea that we are a federal government and a state and a local government, and how that plays out. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I spent some time in the book on that, because I think it's so important. We've really got two sovereign governments in this country. The theory of how when the Constitution was adopted in 1789 was we had a sovereign federal government and a sovereign state government. And state government would then give powers to local governments, cities and counties, to help deliver services. Well, as the country grew and into 50 states and moved into more urban areas, all of this evolved. And we really have now three levels of government: the two sovereign governments, the federal and the state, but local government. And local government is absolutely critical, in my view, in delivering services, whether it's schools or law enforcement or parks or environmental protection. And so they're all three part of our federal system, and all three have to work together or the whole thing doesn't work very well.
And now it's interesting, because the Supreme Court decisions, the question that's been asked on many of these decisions is this a federal role or is this a state role?
It's extremely topical right now, Joan, because as you saw in the Defense of Marriage Act case and the Proposition 8 and the same-sex marriage case out in California, the so-called Federalist argument was a big one about, gee, this is really something the states should handle, isn't it? Why are we doing this at the federal level? You've also seen it in 2011 with the Arizona immigration case and the Affordable Care Act decision. I think that was in 2012. that came out. All of these things related to the role of these three units of government. Who does what? And so it's very important, and it's important to understand.
Well, do you think it's shifting at all? I mean, are the state and local governments as players power waxing or waning at this point?
I think over time here, I think the importance of delivering the services has gone to the local governments quite a bit. But the money power tends to be at the federal and state level. And that's why you need some kind of revenue sharing, which is what the Minnesota Miracle was all about, sharing that revenue with the local units of government to deliver the services. I'll tell you more how much it's shifting after these Supreme Court cases get decided probably this June.
Because in a state like Minnesota, you also mentioned the fact that there are some federal mandates that come from the federal government to the state, and as we know, they're unfunded mandates lots of times.
Right. The federal government has attempted to force the states and to mandate certain things. No Child Left Behind is one example of that. And yet they don't provide the money, don't put the money where their mouth is, kind of thing. And so it makes it extremely difficult for our schools and cities to carry out those mandates. But the raw power to telling them to do it lies with the two sovereign governments, either the state or the federal government. So there's always some pushing and tugging that goes on between these units.
And you mentioned that some of the local governments got really irritated with the state because they felt they could do things maybe differently but more economically than the state was mandating them to do them.
Yes, the same. It holds true from the federal to the state, and also from the state to the local government. The state governments, counties get really mad at the legislature and the states in general for telling them they have to do something, and they say, you know, we can do it ourselves much better if you just let us do it this way and provide at least some of the funding for us. So there's, again, that pushing and tugging between the local government and the states, and between the state and the federal, is always part of our complicated federal system of government, why you have to get beyond the bumper sticker approach to governing.
Well, and actually it's probably another way of balancing the power between the various levels.
Absolutely, it is. It's between the levels, and then you've got the further complicating factor with the three branches of government. The court steps in, the executive branch, and so on. So it's a complicated system, no doubt about it.
Well, now you had some very interesting characters in your book. Anybody that you remember as sort of being, I mean, you mentioned Stanley Holmquist. Are there folks like that who really were statesmen that we should maybe know more about?
Well, Stanley Holmquist was certainly one, and I mentioned several stories about that in the book. One of the people I would certainly mention that played a key role in getting this started was Martin Sable, who was in the legislature for a long time. He was first elected, I think, in 1960, and then went on and served 28 years in the Congress. When I was there, he became Speaker of the House in 1972. And in that session, Joan, for the first time, the Democrats took control again, and we put Republicans, even though they were in the minority party, on a very powerful committee that controls the flow of legislation, then called the Rules Committee. And we put Republicans on that committee, and we had campaigned on that during the election, and they thought once we elected, we'd never do that. That wouldn't really happen. But Martin insisted that, yes, we will, and we are, and he made sure that we got that done. And I think that gave us, those of us who were Democrats, some real credibility with the Republicans, that we were people they could work with, and we'd talk to, and keep our word. And that helped set up a marvelous bipartisan effort that carried on throughout the 70s with some very major legislation.
Well, now, somebody was saying, well, this was a time when there was a lot of ferment going on nationally, too.
Oh, yes, indeed. It was not dissimilar from now. The Vietnam War, we were trying to get out of a losing war at the time, Vietnam, not dissimilar from where we were in Iraq and now in Afghanistan. It was a big civil rights issues going on then. That was primarily the start and the importance and rise of feminism and the role of women in society. And today, now, we're talking about gay rights and those issues are coming along. It was a big environmental issue, energy shortages. There are lines at gas pumps and things back then, very similar to what we're worried about energy usage now. So there's a lot of similarities between the time periods.
Well, it's the thing that really struck me was the fact that you were able to work with the people on the other side of the aisle. There seemed to be some sort of trust there.
There was. I think it started to, again, in large part because of that action on the Rules Committee. But consistently, we worked hard to try to create an atmosphere where we would listen to the other side. We wouldn't always agree, and when it came to party line votes, the Democrats had the majority vote, had big majorities by the time 74 and 76 went along. But it still was a sense of trying to work together. And in that 72 election, where the big change came about, Joan, that was the first time there were a significant increase in number of women. We went from 1 woman to 6 in one election. And then after that, it continued on, obviously very major. The average age dropped significantly in the legislature. And there was a real generational turnover in the 1972 election. And that helped set the stage, and I think people of both parties were younger and willing to trust and work together and had a common interest in making Minnesota a wonderful state.
Yeah, I was amazed at how young everyone was. I mean, you were 30 when you were elected the first time, and there were others who were in that early 30 range too, and now you sort of think of most legislators being a little bit older than that.
Yes, and I think I was talking to somebody the other day who was saying how they're worried about the demographics of the legislature is changing now. And I haven't really studied that, but they were concerned that it's becoming people well into their 50s or real young. And the 30 to 48-year-olds are shrinking in terms of numbers, and that has an adverse effect on things.
So that there's sort of a hole in the middle.
Yes.
Well,
and I haven't really analyzed that. I think it would be an interesting topic, and somebody should.
Well, it is interesting because there have been a number of people who've retired, and then being a legislator is their second career, so to speak.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Well, what lessons can we take from the 70s?
Well, in the book, I talk about 3 main lessons learned. Some of them the hard way, I would add. And that one is the need to talk to each other. I think that's very important. But really the part of that is to understand culture and values. You have to understand where the culture is, what are people's values. If you talk about that, I think you can get to some common ground typically, because in Minnesota, I think there's a lot of common culture and values, whether you're rural or suburban or metropolitan, and it's important to understand that. The second thing is to think in 3 dimensions, and that means state, federal, and local governments. And they all have to work together and dovetail, or else it just breaks down. It doesn't work. We don't deliver the services properly. And the third one is leadership matters. I think who our leaders are, the role of Martin Sable, Nick Coleman, Stanley Holmquist. These were wonderful people who had a good perspective, understanding of history, and cared about their state.
Now, you mentioned some of these folks, and there was that phrase, career politicians. And what would you say if somebody said, well, he's a career politician?
I would say, well, you know, I would ask, what does that mean? If the person has been there a long time and done a wonderful job, I would applaud and say, that's just great. I generally don't think that term limits, at least unless they're pretty long, are going to solve any problems. Because it takes a while, believe me, to understand and learn how this stuff works. It's a complicated place in the legislature. And the system, as we've talked about now, you've got 3 levels, 3 branches at 2 of the levels at least, so you got a lot of moving parts. And to figure that out takes some time. So just the fact that somebody's a career politician, and if they say it derisively, as they usually do, I think you got to probe beyond that bumper sticker approach a little bit and say, what do you mean and why, and get into it. Because there are some people who have been there a long time. Martin Sable, again, a good example. Nick Coleman was another. Stanley Holmquist have been around a long time. They were good politicians and good governmental leaders.
And they stayed on for.
And they stayed on for a long time.
Yeah, I was amazed at Martin Sable that he started when he was just a college grad, and that he retired at retirement age.
That's right, he did. He served in the Minnesota legislature for a long time, and for 16 years, I think it was, or 18 years in the Minnesota legislature, and then 28 years in Congress.
Well, now you've done a lot of research and you've thought about this a lot. If you were going to give some advice to the governor and the legislators today, here's your chance. What would you say?
I would say go out and talk to each other. I just hammer that one home. I would also say ask for advice from other people. One of the things that Wendell Anderson did when he was governor, he set up a program called the Loaned Executive Action Program, or LEAP. And that was a program that had huge success and did a lot of good for the state. And I think that's important. But the biggest one is go out and talk to each other. Sit down and talk, and don't just talk about, well, would you vote for this bill if I did that? And if I raise taxes a penny here and a nickel there, would you do this? But talk about what's it like in your community? How is the implement dealer doing? How are the farmers doing? How's the manufacturing plant doing? How are the schools doing? What do you think about that? What can we do? How do we solve this gun problem? One of the things I talked about in the bill was the gun control bill. And just, you talk about it instead of just jumping to conclusions and say, well, rural people don't want any gun control, period. That's not true, in my judgment. I think if you talk, they want safety and they want their kids safe and all as well, and you can usually figure out if you talk to each other enough.
So, and what you're really saying is that they have common interest at heart.
They have, absolutely, they have common values. Talk about that culture and values, I just think is so important. And then once you get a common value there, then you figure out about it in 3 dimensions, well, what unit of government should solve the particular problem that you just have a common value for. And also to, I would say very much so, invest in the future. And we do have to, it takes some money to run a government and to keep a state going strong, and we need to do that. And that's why I think hopefully they're on the right track this session about bringing in some more revenue as well, and then spend it wisely.
Well, now you've heard from somebody who was in the trenches and gave some good advice to those who are there now. Our guest this evening was Tom Berg, and he has written this really interesting book, Minnesota's Miracle. If you want to learn more about politics, this is the volume to pick up. So Tom, thanks so much for being with this fascinating book, and really great to talk to you about it.
Thank you, Joan. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. And thanks to you for tuning in to We the People. This is Joan Higginbotham for the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis saying thanks, and we hope you'll join us again.